Okay, welcome to this talk on understanding human error. We are going to talk about a new approach to morbidity and mortality conferences that looks at human factors engineering and using Sidney Dekker's approach. Now, Sidney Dekker wrote a book called The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, and human error is in quotes. Why is that? Because humans make mistakes, slips, lapses, and so any system that is dependent on humans not making mistakes is bound to fail. We often strive to standardize processes and training to try to minimize the human part of the equation. But you know what? In fact, the risk of an accident is more a function of the complexity of the system than it is of the people involved. Humans are not a source of weakness, but they're a source of resilience. Our flexibility to respond to unpredictable inputs and situations allows us to adapt to all the variability that exists in the system. This is our strength. This is the strength that humans bring to the table. And so this talk is based on this book by Sidney Dekker. He's a pilot and a human factors engineer. Now, the study of human error comes from many industrial accidents and plane crashes, and this is one that is commonly used as an example from Tenerife, Spain. On March 27, 1977, two Boeing planes, a KLM plane and a Pan Am plane, collided on a runway, resulting in 583 fatalities in the deadliest crash in aviation history. Now, we could be quick to blame the pilot of the KLM flight for ramming into the Pan Am jet after not being given proper clearance for takeoff. But the story is, of course, much more complicated than that. So let's take a look. There was a terrorist incident on the nearby Gran Canaria airport that diverted all flights over to Tenerife, including the two planes that were involved in the crash. There were patches of thick fog that reduced visibility for all the planes and the control tower. And both planes were on the runway awaiting clearance, but were not really sure which taxiway they were on. They couldn't see it in the fog. The KLM pilot had mistakenly understood the control tower as giving them clearance for takeoff. The first officer had said they were ready for takeoff, and the control tower responded okay to signify that they got the message. But the pilots took it to mean that they were ready to go take off. And so the pilot told the first officer, "We're going." The tower responded, "Stand by for takeoff. I will call you." But this was obscured by feedback interference from the other plane, the Pan Am flight. And so the KLM pilots never heard it. And the Pan Am flight responded, "We're taxiing down the runway." But this too was blocked by the interference. So the control tower heard none of this. It didn't even realize that these two flights were both going to the runway. All right. It didn't also help that the tower spoke predominantly Spanish and the KLM pilots predominantly English. The planes could not see each other due to the fog, and the airport didn't have ground-based radar. Now, ultimately, the KLM plane ran straight into the top of the Pan Am flight. Now, examination of this disaster uncovered that it was not simply, quote, human error that led to this crash, but a series of problems, right? We had airport congestion, we had a thick fog, we had language barriers, we had misunderstood jargon, we had uncomfortability of the subordinates questioning their superiors, and there were all sorts of technical issues as well. Examination of this accident led to many changes in airplanes travel that led to standardized language, cockpit checklists, team decision-making, like the crew management decision training that we all take now. And it significantly improved the complex system of air travel. And so why not apply it to healthcare, right? There are two perspectives you can take on human error. You can blame or you can understand. The blame theory is the bad apple theory. Errors are due to human frailties. The system itself is fine. Errors would be eliminated if we could only ensure compliance. If people tried harder or if people just knew more. We can see evidence of this, right, with stricter procedures that we have in response to the adverse events, or when we force additional training on people. The assumption is if you remove the bad apples, then all the problems go away. Alternatively, you could control the bad apples to minimize some of the damage, perhaps using procedures or technology. This is the blame side of the coin. Let's look at the other side, which is the understand side. As Sidney Dekker says, no one comes to work wanting to do a bad job. Most people know what they need to know. Most people can do what they need to do. But something prevented this from happening, right? Most people come to work creating safety. They have to negotiate all kinds of competing goals in order to make that happen. but something went wrong, and it is our job to figure out what that thing is. And the local rationality principle here says that the point is not to see where people went wrong, but what made them make the choices they did. What made them do what made them make sense of all those things. So it is our job to discover why everything made sense to them at the time. Something pushed them to understand the situation as they did and choose the actions they did. We need to figure out what that was. Otherwise, when other people are placed in similar conditions, they're going to probably make the same choices. Now, blaming seems to be hardwired into us, right? Hindsight bias says that when we look back on a scenario, knowing the outcome, we are able to pick out things that people who at the time couldn't see and they had missed, right? We oversimplify causality by saying, if they had only seen this, the error would have been avoided. The only reason we were able to see that thing was because we knew the outcome. And we tend to blame the first source that we come across, and that's always the people. Okay, counterfactuals. Counterfactuals are when things that could have happened or should have happened or would have happened that could have avoided an error. So these are things that could have happened but didn't. It's counter to the fact. Hence counterfactuals. These hypothetical situations are so easy to construct to explain away what happened. Instead of saying you shoulda, coulda, woulda, we need to explain what actually did happen. And the final one here is the proximity to error. We focus on the people who are closer in time and space to where the adverse event happened, what Sidney Dekker called the sharp end, while we tend to ignore people who set up the scenario to happen in the first place, those who designed the scenarios and systems. That's called the blunt end. And we'll talk more about how one way to get to that using the 5 whys technique in a second. All right, just culture is a method of ensuring the fact that we want to keep people accountable where they need to be held accountable, but understanding and acknowledging that most adverse events are not due to human error. Right? So we use the just culture principles, which we're going to look at. And Dr. Lucian Leap made this quote here, which says that, punishing people for error is what prevents us from reporting error and then learning from our mistakes. And so what we should be doing is asking several questions, like, did the individual intend to cause harm? Did they come to work drunk or impaired? Could 2 or 3 peers have made the same mistakes in similar circumstances? Or does this person have a history of making similar mistakes in the past? So there are certainly blameworthy incidents, someone who deliberately interferes to achieve an adverse outcome, or someone who creates an intimidating or hostile or unsafe work environment, or someone who threatens patient safety. But most are not, right? But we need to make sure that everybody is appropriately addressed. And so we have this as the just culture algorithm. So you can see this purple circle at the top is the bad outcome. And from there, we're going to go to various outcomes. So for sabotage, right, where someone deliberately causes a bad thing to happen and they meant for that bad thing to happen, they need severe sanctions. For someone that was reckless, meaning they knowingly did something wrong, but they didn't want something bad to happen, they were reckless. And so they need to have less severe, but still somewhat severe, final warning and a negative performance evaluation. For people who didn't necessarily knowingly violate procedures and didn't intend for bad things to happen, but maybe they did because they just didn't know, and then it might be negligent error, especially if 2 or 3 people with the same training would not have done the same thing. Then we said, we need to train you up because you shouldn't have made that mistake. And then we have over here repeated mistakes. If you haven't learned from your mistakes in the past, right? If you have a history of making the same mistake, then we need to give you a final warning and negative performance evaluation. But most of them fall over here in the no blame error, where it was not sabotage. You were not being reckless. You followed the procedures as they were written, and this is the first time you did it, right? Then we need to document the error and training for everyone, and really looking for causes that could perhaps prevent this. And this is the just culture algorithm, which is very important. So, how can we use this to change our morbidity and mortality conferences? The old way that we used to do it is the person who made the error, who caused the adverse event was aggressively questioned by people who had the benefit of hindsight. And people, this adversarial environment would cause people to not want to admit mistakes and then hide potential learning opportunities, because no one wants to be subject to such a horrible interrogation. And hiding errors eliminates potential learning opportunities from coming to light. And the system can't improve then. Instead, people are motivated by fear to hide the errors. That's the old way. We don't really do it that way anyway. This is perhaps the way that we tend to do it more commonly now. We present the facts, what we call the thin timeline, that shows the dates and times of the events within the patient context, but it lacks the context. It lacks what was the team thinking and why did they make those decisions. And usually it ends with a mini lecture of the disease process, and this comes with the implication that the team should have known better. Had they had known what I'm teaching you right now, they wouldn't have made this mistake. Yes, it's kinder and gentler, but it still implies blame. Now, the just culture method and the way that Sidney Dekker is advocating is that we need to understand local rationality. We need to understand why the practitioners made the choices that they did, and then identify potential system changes so that we can prevent other people from making the same mistake. We need to have an independent team with expertise both in the subject where the error occurred, so that's subject matter expertise, and also in patient safety. And that team is going to review the event with the goal of understanding why the adverse event happened. They aim to understand the choices that the team made starting from the position that that person didn't intend for something bad to happen. And then the team will review and identify critical junctures that led to the adverse event and come up with potential changes to the system that could help prevent others from making the same errors. So let's look at this approach, right? The first thing you need to do is assemble a diverse team. So get docs on the team, get residents, get nurses, pharmacists, techs, patients, students. Get as many, varying perspectives as you can. Keep the team to be a reasonable size. It can't be huge because you still need to get work done. But you want diversity and you want different perspectives. Who is not on the team are the people who committed the acts that led to the adverse event. They're going to be consulted for sure, but they should not be on the team because they have a bias. The next thing you want to do is build a thin timeline. And so when it was in plane crashes, we would look at the black box or the flight recorder, which oddly enough is orange. I don't know why they call it a black box. And that would record all the communications between the pilots and the control tower, as well as all the actions that they did. Now, in medicine, we have the chart, and that's where we record all of those. This is a starting point, though. Remember, it excludes all the context necessary to understand local rationality. Then you need to collect the human factors data. We need to interview all the relevant people to understand what happened from their point of view. It's best done early because people's memory tends to degrade with time. Ask them what was happening in the room. Why did you make the choices you did? What was your understanding of the situation and why? Here is a figure that came from the MCRIT blog, and I'll put a link in the notes next to this video on this. And these are the different areas of questions you could ask of the providers. Like what was your focus of attention and why when they look at their self? They can look at things from a team perspective. What was the capacity of the team to handle the event? How did the team function as a team? You can look from an environment perspective. What were the ergonomics, the physical ergonomics that contributed to the event? Maybe the room was too hot, or maybe the lights were off or something. I don't know. Then patients sometimes will play a role. Maybe the patient was very aggressive. And then system issues. And so you want to look at them from all these different perspectives to build this thick timeline. Our goal, remember, is to address the fact that the things that can be obvious in hindsight, but once you know what the providers were seeing, you can understand what made intelligent, conscientious providers make the choices that led to the error. We need to understand it to the point that we could possibly see ourselves having made that same error. And you may have to go back and forth and interview people several times in order to get clarification. So then you're going to build the thick timeline, where you overlay the context of the interviews on the thin timeline. I'm going to show you an example of this. Then you're going to construct causes. You don't find causes, you construct them, because causes are not due to one thing. It's usually a whole bunch of different things, and it's going to take your intelligence to try to figure out what may have led to this choice. Look back on the thick timeline and look for systemic problems. You may need to follow the Toyota's 5 whys, which was also used at the car company Toyota, in which you ask why of an event, and then you ask, why did that thing happen, to the answer. Then the answer you get to that, you ask, well, why did that thing happen? And you keep doing this, almost like a toddler asking why several times. So someone, maybe the problem was a drug wasn't given. So you ask, why did you not give the drug? And they respond, well, I didn't understand the doctor's order. And say, okay, why did you not understand the doctor's order? So that's our second why. Well, because she was unclear. All right, third why. Why was the doctor unclear? I don't think she was sure which patient we were referring to. Okay, fourth why. Why were you not sure which patient, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see how we go back, and then maybe we get down to the fact that there were 3 patients with very similar names. There was no way to distinguish, and that's a system solution that we could fix. And the final thing you want to, and so here is a picture of a fishbone diagram where we typically will plot out all these whys. And so you can see it's designed around those things that we had in the thick timeline: provider causes, team causes, patient causes, environment, system, and other. And you will fill in here some of the potential causes. And then the next thing you want to do, the last thing you want to do, is make recommendations. What do we need to change? Can we brainstorm some solutions such that this change would prevent others from having the same outcomes if they were placed in the same situation? Remember that quick fixes, like retraining, reprimanding, tend not to be the right answer, because the human error is a complex problem and is part of a complex system. So the solutions tend not to be really quick solutions. All right, how should we do the presentations? First thing, you got to remember, this is protected data. It cannot go on Google, which is not protected. And each slide needs language to protect all the information under the QI process. The data has patient information, so it's protected under HIPAA. And so we can't use systems like Google Slides or Zoom, which are not HIPAA compliant. And we need medical legal protection as well, right? Many providers fear that patient safety event reports could be used against them in medical malpractice cases or disciplinary proceedings. So the Illinois Medical Studies Act provides legal privilege and confidentiality protections to the people and the information in the quality review, meaning this cannot be used in discovery in court cases. This is used to make us get better, and we want to protect this. And so you can see at the bottom of this slide, we have some words, and this should be on the bottom of all of our slides to be QI protected. This document is privileged and confidential under the Illinois Medical Studies Act and should not be shared or distributed other than through Quality Assurance Committee structure. If you use the template that we give to you, that should be at the bottom of each slide. All right. So the first thing you want to do is present the data, and we're going to start with the thin timeline, and this is what we typically will see, right? Dates, times, and what ended up happening that oftentimes we're copying out of the chart. And that's great, and you want to get as many people input in here, so this might be a junior member of the team that presents this. Then the next thing you want to do, so we have it, you can see the timeline goes on and on. Then you want to add the human factors context on top of this thin timeline. Remember that local rationality principle. We need to understand what was going on, what made them make the choices that they made. And so here, now we have that thick timeline. We have the thin timeline at the top and the thick timeline at the bottom. We could say, the patient was presenting with chest pain, but there were 8 patients waiting to be triaged. The patient was somewhat uncooperative and yelling at the triage nurse. An MSC was done noting elevated blood pressure and recommended repeating the blood pressure, but there were 32 patients waiting to be seen, so there was a delay, right? So you can see how now we have some context in there. You can see this one, there's a code in the next door room, and the team was busy intubating a patient, and so that adds a little bit more information as to what was happening. And so here's more of the thick timeline. All right, next you want to construct causes, and the fishbone diagram is useful in order to do that. And so in this case, you can see provider cases. Maybe the provider was fatigued, it was their 3rd night in a row, and they were distracted because they were focused on the code next door. the patient was aggressive, right? Maybe the system, there was we have a culture here of not calling in others for help when we are trying to run 2 codes at once. We didn't call the other person, and maybe ED boarding. And so you can see all the different potential things that you want to put in there. And you want to build a good picture of what might have caused this to happen. And finally, you want to brainstorm solutions, and these solutions should be SMART solutions: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound solutions. So you might say, well, for simultaneous codes, we should automatically call the Pod C attending to come and take one. For uncooperative patients with abnormal vitals, they need to be properly evaluated quickly, and maybe they need to be sedated if they're that uncooperative. You can come up with a bunch of solutions that way. Now, when you present this, we probably spend most of our time on the thin timeline, on the part which is just presenting the data and asking people, okay, what would you think? And asking them to come up with differentials, which is great. But we really don't want to do that at the expense of looking at deeper solutions, which means what could we have done to improve the situation, which is just as valuable to know as coming up with a differential is how can I make this better? Because everybody has 2 jobs when they come to work. They have their job, and they have the job of making their job better. That's the head of the IHI's quote. And so we want to perhaps spend maybe 10 minutes on that thin timeline, maybe another 10 minutes on the thick timeline, and then spend a great deal of time on that fishbone diagram and coming up with potential solutions. So in conclusion, remember that no one comes to work wanting to do a bad job. Remember the local rationality principles, that we have to understand what made people make the choices that they made. And we're always going to use just culture principles, which means that we're going to treat people fairly, right? If they did something on purpose and they need to be sanctioned, we will do that, but most of the time it is not. And when we present cases, we need to understand by building a thin and a thick timeline to understand the context so that we can construct causes, look for, and then brainstorm for solutions. Okay, thank you guys very much for watching. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you later.